Something just shifted in the Middle East, and the consequences may extend far beyond the immediate headlines. A move widely described as unthinkable has pushed Iran, the United States, and Israel into a new and more dangerous phase of confrontation. What happens next may not simply alter military calculations. It may reshape the regional balance for years. In this discussion, John Helmer examines why this moment matters, why it stands apart from previous rounds of escalation, and why so many analysts now believe the old assumptions no longer apply. The central question is no longer whether tensions are rising. The question is whether a threshold has already been crossed. For years, the region has operated under a fragile pattern of deterrence. Iran projected influence through allies, proxies, missile forces, and strategic patience. Israel relied on intelligence, reach, preemption, and the belief that escalation could be controlled. The United States tried to maintain pressure, preserve alliances, and prevent any conflict from expanding into a wider war. That structure now appears far less stable than it once did. A dramatic Iranian move, one serious enough to be called unthinkable by observers across the political spectrum, has forced every actor in the region to reevaluate both risk and response. What once looked like a managed contest now looks increasingly like an open test of credibility. That is the heart of this story. It is not only about military action, it is about signaling, deterrence, prestige, and the danger that comes when states feel compelled to prove that their warnings mean something. Once that cycle begins, every response is judged not only by its immediate effect, but by what it says about resolve. Iran's calculation, as Helmer explores it, appears to rest on a simple but consequential idea. If pressure continues to intensify, then passivity may become more dangerous than action. In that view, an extraordinary move is not irrational. It is a message. It is an attempt to redraw the boundaries of what opponents believe Iran is willing to do. For Tehran, that matters at several levels. It matters domestically, where the leadership cannot afford to look weak under sustained external pressure. It matters regionally, where allies and rivals alike are watching for any sign of hesitation. And it matters internationally, where the wider message is aimed at Washington, Jerusalem, and every capital trying to assess the limits of Iranian restraint. Israel, in turn, reads such moves through a very different strategic lens. Israeli decision-makers have long argued that threats left unanswered do not remain contained. They grow, they become normalized, they invite repetition. From that standpoint, any major Iranian escalation must be met with a response strong enough to restore deterrence and clear enough to prevent ambiguity. The United States faces a parallel but distinct dilemma. Washington wants to support Israel, reassure partners, and prevent a regional breakdown. At the same time, it must weigh the costs of deeper military involvement, the risk to forces across the region, the impact on global markets, and the possibility that a response designed to stabilize the situation could instead widen it. This is where the story becomes especially serious. The challenge is not simply choosing whether to respond. The challenge is choosing how to respond without triggering a chain reaction. Every military planner understands that once multiple actors begin signaling through force, control becomes harder to maintain. Intentions can be misread. Limits can be tested. Time for diplomacy can disappear. Helmer's argument places this moment in a broader historical pattern. Major turning points in the Middle East rarely announce themselves as final breaks from the past. That possibility now hangs over the region. If Iran has demonstrated a new willingness to act directly or more openly than before, then the strategic map changes. If Israel concludes that the previous rules of restraint are over, then its doctrine changes as well. And if the United States decides that deterrence must be reestablished through unmistakable force, then the scope of the confrontation could expand dramatically. None of this unfolds in a vacuum. The Middle East today is already shaped by overlapping wars, unresolved rivalries, political fragmentation, energy concerns, and competing global interests. Tensions involving Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, the Gulf, and the Red Sea have already stretched the regional system. Another major shock does not land on calm ground. It lands on a landscape already under strain. That is why one move can produce consequences far beyond its immediate target. A strike, a retaliation, an intercepted attack, a threat broadcast to domestic audiences, or a warning sent through diplomatic back channels can each trigger reactions in multiple theaters at once. What appears localized in the first hours may become regional in the days that follow. There is also the problem of prestige. States do not think only in terms of battlefield outcomes. They think in terms of reputation. Can they protect allies? Can they impose costs? Can they absorb pressure without appearing vulnerable? These questions often shape decisions as much as military necessity does, and sometimes more. Iran's leaders understand that perception is part of power. If they believe prior caution has failed to stop attacks, sanctions, or strategic isolation, then a more dramatic posture may appear necessary. In that sense, the unthinkable move is not merely operational. It is psychological. It is designed to force opponents to reconsider the cost of underestimating Iran's willingness to escalate. Israel sees that psychological dimension clearly, which is why restraint can itself become risky from the Israeli perspective. If an extraordinary action is not answered decisively, then deterrence may weaken. And once deterrence weakens, the fear in Jerusalem is that larger threats become more likely, not less likely. Washington is caught between these logics. It understands Israel's security arguments and its own commitments, but it also understands the broader strategic field, including the danger of being drawn into an open-ended regional war. The American response, therefore, is rarely just about a single incident. It is about alliance management, force protection, domestic politics, oil prices, global shipping, and the message sent to adversaries elsewhere. That is why official responses often sound carefully calibrated in public, while urgent consultations unfold in private. Governments speak the language of stability even as they prepare for worst-case scenarios. They say they seek de-escalation while moving assets, reinforcing positions, and testing diplomatic channels at high speed. Helmer's framing suggests that this latest episode may have accelerated that exact process. Publicly, every side may claim to want containment. Privately, every side may be revising contingency plans for a larger conflict. That gap between stated restraint and actual preparation is one of the most dangerous features of modern crisis politics. There is another layer here that should not be ignored. The meaning of an unthinkable move depends not only on what was done, but on what had previously been ruled out. In deterrence systems, the most powerful acts are often those that break expectation. They show that old red lines may no longer function as intended. They create uncertainty where predictability once offered, at least some measure of stability. Uncertainty is not neutral. It changes the behavior of militaries, governments, investors, and allied networks. It affects air defense postures, maritime traffic, diplomatic signaling, and public messaging. It raises the chance that leaders, under pressure, will choose speed over caution, and in crisis environments, speed can be a threat multiplier. The phrase that the Middle East will never be the same should be understood in that context. It does not necessarily mean that borders change overnight or that full-scale war becomes inevitable tomorrow. It means that strategic assumptions can be shattered in a single episode. Once shattered, they are not easily restored. One assumption now under strain is the belief that escalation ladders can always be managed through familiar routines. Another is the belief that indirect confrontation will remain indirect forever. A third is the belief that major powers can compartmentalize regional conflicts without eventually confronting the links between them. If those assumptions are no longer reliable, then policy choices become harder. For Iran, the next question is whether the move achieved deterrent value or merely invited harsher retaliation. For Israel, the question is whether force can restore security without opening multiple fronts at once. For the United States, the question is whether alliance commitments can be upheld without entering a conflict on terms not of its choosing. These are not abstract issues. They affect military deployments, intelligence priorities, diplomatic agendas, and economic expectations across the region. They affect civilians who already live under deep uncertainty, and they affect outside powers that may publicly call for restraint while quietly positioning themselves for prolonged instability. Regional actors beyond the main triangle are watching closely. Gulf states will be measuring the risks to infrastructure, trade corridors, and internal stability. Non-state armed groups will be assessing opportunities and vulnerabilities. Governments in neighboring states will be asking whether the coming phase is one of limited signaling or a prelude to sustained confrontation. That wider audience matters because crises are rarely controlled only by the actors who initiate them. Once perceptions shift across the region, secondary responses begin to shape the picture. Alliances tighten or fray. Informal channels become more active. Local actors test what they think the new environment allows. The original confrontation can quickly become only one part of a larger chain. Helmer's analysis also points to a recurring problem in major geopolitical crises: the temptation to read immediate military exchanges as complete explanations. They are not. Beneath every strike or warning lies a deeper contest over political order, regional influence, and the credibility of national strategy. A dramatic action is often the surface expression of a much longer struggle. In that struggle, timing matters. Leaders do not act in ideal conditions. They act under pressure, with imperfect intelligence, domestic constraints, and adversaries who are trying to shape the narrative at the same time. Decisions made in such moments can look contradictory from the outside because they are responding to multiple audiences at once. Iran, for example, may seek to project strength without inviting total war. Israel may seek to punish and deter without becoming trapped in an expanded regional battlefield. The United States may seek to reassure allies without surrendering strategic flexibility. Each of those goals is understandable. The difficulty is that they can collide with one another in practice. That collision is where miscalculation enters. If one side believes it has sent a limited message, while another reads it as a foundational challenge, then the response gap widens. If one government thinks it has reestablished deterrence, while its opponent sees only provocation, then the cycle intensifies. This is why so many crises become larger after each side insists it is acting defensively. The words used by officials matter, but the structure of incentives matters more. If every side believes restraint looks like weakness, then the system rewards escalation. If every side believes delay allows the opponent to regroup, then the pressure for immediate action increases. These are classic warning signs in any deteriorating deterrence environment. The Middle East has seen such patterns before, but this moment may be different in scale and significance. The regional architecture is already more fragmented than in many previous periods. External powers are more stretched. Public trust in diplomatic processes is lower, and the speed of information, reaction, and counter-reaction is faster than ever. That acceleration has consequences. It compresses decision-making. It magnifies public pressure. It empowers symbolic gestures that can carry strategic weight. And it makes it harder for leaders to pause without appearing indecisive. In other words, the political space for careful recalibration may be shrinking precisely when it is needed most. Helmer's central warning appears to be that this is not a passing flare-up that can be dismissed as another familiar exchange. It may represent a structural change. If that is correct, then analysts, policymakers, and the public will need to stop asking when the old status quo will return. The more urgent question is, what is replacing it? That replacement could take several forms. It could be a colder and more openly militarized balance in which direct signaling becomes normal. It could be a period of repeated crisis management with higher risks each time, or it could slide into a broader confrontation that draws in multiple fronts and leaves no actor fully in control of the outcome. Even if the immediate temperature drops, the after effects may remain. Once thresholds are crossed, they tend to leave institutional and psychological traces. Defense planning changes, intelligence assessments change, political rhetoric hardens, diplomatic trust erodes. Future incidents are then interpreted through a darker lens. This is why the phrase "never be the same" should not be treated as simple drama in geopolitical terms. It may reflect a real possibility. A region changes when the actors within it stop believing in the old limits. Once they stop believing, they start planning, moving, and reacting differently. That is how strategic eras end. John Helmer's contribution here is to push past surface commentary and focus on the significance of the move itself. Why was it considered unthinkable? What message was intended? How are the United States and Israel likely to interpret it? And what does that tell us about the stability or instability of the next phase? Those questions matter because narratives shape policy. If Iran's action is seen as proof that deterrence failed, responses will harden. If it is seen as a calibrated attempt to impose new boundaries, then negotiations, threats, and military posturing will all be adjusted accordingly. If it is seen as the opening of a more direct era of conflict, then regional and international preparations will reflect that judgment. The same applies to Israel's response. A measured response sends one message. A punitive response sends another. A response designed for immediate tactical effect may have very different strategic consequences from one designed to alter long-term deterrence. Each option carries costs, and each carries the risk of producing the opposite of its intended effect. For the United States, the challenge is even broader. American policymakers must decide how to support an ally, preserve credibility, and manage escalation at the same time. They must also consider the views of partners across the region, the exposure of American personnel, and the global implications of any prolonged conflict. This is not a narrow security problem. It is a full-spectrum strategic test, and that is why this moment deserves close attention. It is not only about who struck, who responded, or who claimed success. It is about whether the underlying rules of regional confrontation are breaking down. If they are, then every future crisis will unfold in a more volatile environment than the one that came before. What makes the situation especially fragile is that all sides can plausibly believe they are acting rationally. Iran may see assertiveness as necessary deterrence. Israel may see retaliation as necessary defense. The United States may see intervention or pressure as necessary stabilization. Rational motives do not guarantee stable outcomes. In fact, they can produce dangerous escalation when each side's logic is incompatible with the other's. That is the deeper warning running through this analysis. History does not change only when leaders announce new doctrines or sign major treaties. It also changes when actions expose that the old doctrines no longer work. A single event can reveal that deterrence has weakened, that assumptions were misplaced, and that a region has entered a new strategic chapter. If that is where the Middle East now stands, then the responses of Iran, Israel, and the United States in the coming period will matter enormously, not only because they will shape the next round of confrontation, but because they will help define the rules of the new era. Whether those rules lead to containment, chronic instability, or wider war remains uncertain. What is clear is that this story cannot be understood as an isolated flashpoint. It belongs to a longer chain of strategic competition, unresolved conflict, mutual distrust, and shrinking room for error. That chain has now tightened. The margin for misreading intent may be narrower than at any point in recent memory. So when Helmer says the Middle East will never be the same, the statement is not merely rhetorical. It is a warning about transformation under pressure. It is a recognition that one extraordinary move can force all major actors to reveal what they are prepared to risk, what they are prepared to defend, and how far they are prepared to go. The world is now watching how Iran frames its action, how Israel defines its red lines, and how the United States calibrates support and restraint. Those choices will not just determine the next headline. They may determine whether the region settles into a harsher equilibrium or moves toward a much more dangerous rupture. This is the point where close analysis matters more than slogans. The details of signaling, response, and interpretation will shape the path ahead. The old language of routine escalation may no longer be enough to explain what is happening. Something larger may be underway. If so, then this is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of a new and uncertain phase. The strategic map is shifting, the assumptions are changing, and the consequences may outlast the immediate crisis by years. The Middle East has entered a moment that could redefine its future, and everyone involved now has to decide what kind of future they are prepared to create. Follow for more analysis on Substack, X, and Patreon. If you would like to support the work directly, support is available through PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. And for this discussion, John Helmer's message is unmistakable. The region has crossed into dangerous territory. The responses are already reshaping the balance, and the Middle East may not look the same again.